Hey, this is Brian L, and this is a primer on Linode, Capistrano, and deploying Rails, and actually setting it up in Debian Etch. Everyone doing the Rails Rumble, good luck and happy coding.
When you go to the Linode webpage, the first thing you're going to need to do is log into your account using the credentials that have been supplied to you. You'll note when you log in, you have no existing configuration profile. So the first thing you're going to need to do is create one. For this demo, I'm using Debian 4.0, and I'm going to select it from the list. And then I'm going to adjust the allocation of my disk image. I'm going to use 300 megabytes for swap rather than 256 due to the increase that Linode just started. Make sure to remember your root password that you're entering here because you will need it to log into your server after it is created. After you return to the dashboard, you will need to wait until the jobs that are used to build your server have completed running. You will notice that the status is in queue right now. After your host jobs have completed, you are now ready to boot your server for the first time. Linode provides a remote console access which allows you to see your server booting and allows you to log in from the console like you are right in front of it. What you can do is copy this command like I did and then log in using the passwords you used to log into the Linode manager.
We are now ready to SSH into the server for the first time. Before we start the install process, we're going to have to check our sources list just to make sure that we have the right sources defined. Seeing as we do, now what we're going to do is update our app cache. After our app cache is updated, we now need to install the software. We're going to install Ruby 1.8 Dev, Rails, RI and RDoc, RI and IRB, and then RDoc, libmysql for Ruby, and then MySQL Server, and then Nginx in Subversion so we can get our software, and then Build Essentials so we can actually build the modules needed, and then sudo so we can get to root easily. And after I clean up this typo with libmysql-ruby, we will get installing. Make sure that you remember this MySQL root password. You will need it later. You can enjoy the rest of the Debian provided scroll as the installation process completes. We now need to install RubyGems so we can complete the installation for dependencies for our server. Since I don't know the URL, I always search for it in Google. And all you need to do is download it from RubyForge. I normally choose to download it using wget just because it's easier that way. I actually sped the process for installing RubyGems up a little bit by cutting out some of the video because this does take quite a few seconds. So be patient while it generates its RI and its RDoc. It does complete eventually. After you install RubyGems, you next need to install Mongrel. The first time you install Mongrel, it may fail, saying that it can't find it in any repository. Just try it again, and it does work the second time. Once again, I've cut out a little bit of the clip in the interest of time. This actually does take a little bit of time, but it does complete. After you install Mongrel, you'll need to install Mongrel Cluster. We'll use Mongrel Cluster to actually run more than one Mongrel at a time. We'll now need a user with which to run our Rails application with. I'm just going to use Mongrel as my user. Notice that I am only creating a home directory and not setting a password for this user. After you create the user, I'm going to add it to the visudo file with a no password. Some people think this might not be as secure, but for our little demo, this will do. As you see, we can now sudo to root from Mongrel with no password. Now we need to go back to our local host, our workstation, and prepare for deploying our application to our Linode VPS. The first thing I'm going to do is generate an RSA key. What I'm doing here is actually running SSH keygen and generating an RSA key. Next, I am going to copy this RSA key to my VPS. We'll need to prepare a directory to store our authorized keys for the Mongrel user on the VPS. I've created a directory called .ssh and change modded to 700 so no one else can see it. What I'm going to do now is copy the IDE_RSA.pub to my authorized keys file. After I do this, I will be able to log in from my local host to the VPS using a public key. I now need to make sure that Capistrano is installed locally. I'll need to check out my web app locally so that I can apply Capistrano to it. We will not be using the default deploy.rb that comes with Capistrano. I prepared another one, and I will make sure that it is available on my site, Smartacus. Some of the highlights of this new deploy.rb is that it will create a database configuration for you when you run setup or deploy:setup. It'll ask you for your user and your password, and then it uses adhere_doc to actually create your database.yaml. This way, you don't have to store this in your repository. It will also create a Mongrel cluster YAML file for you too. There is no real information needed for this that it can already get, so it will not prompt you for anything. And by default, it'll run 3 servers starting on port 8000. This next namespace localize actually copies the two files generated before, database.yaml and mongrel cluster.yaml, to your current running directory. And because we're using mongrel cluster, we will actually need to override the default deploy :stop and default deploy :restart. And using Capistrano's new after hooks feature, I'll make sure that everything gets run where it needs to be run. To actually start up your application, Capistrano looks for a script called script/spin. You'll notice that I called it spinner here. This is actually a typo that I will clean up later. In the spin script, all I'm going to do is call mongrel rails cluster start, and that's it. We'll need to make sure to create a MySQL database for our application. We could have cooked up a Capistrano script to create this. I just figured it would be simpler to do it right here at the command line since I'm only going to be doing it one time.
Now what we need to do is configure Nginx. So what we're going to do is
I am also using a pre-built Nginx configuration. It's a little bit long, and I think it would take a considerable time to explain it right here. This will also be available on my site, Smartacus, for you to view. Now that we have the Nginx configuration on our VPS, I'm going to copy it to Etsy Nginx and restart my Nginx server. We now need to check in our Capistrano configuration and also check in the errors and fixes that I made earlier to the spinner script. You'll notice that the custom tasks that I added to my deploy.rb are in my Capistrano task list. We are now going to run the deploy setup and the deploy code to get our application onto the VPS. As you'll be able to see in a second, our application has been deployed and started. We can now run our application for the first time. It looks like a successful deploy. It is now time to make our application reboot proof. The first thing I'm going to do is make an etc mongrel cluster directory. After that, I am going to symbolically link the mongrel cluster configuration from my blog to the etc mongrel cluster directory. Next, I'm going to copy a supplied mongrel cluster init script from the Ruby gems to my etc initd. This will save me some time from having to write an init script for mongrel cluster. After the file is copied, I will make sure it has the right permissions, and then I will tell rcupdated, which is a Debian thing, or update-rcd to actually boot my mongrel cluster init script at boot time. Now we're going to reboot and we'll test to see if our server is actually reboot proof. As you can see, our server is down and not responding right now. Now it is time to restart it. What we're going to do now is make a quick change to our application and deploy it again so we can actually see that the updates are working. All I'm going to do is modify the only view in here with some more text. Our Rails app is now restarting itself, and we will next test to see if our update was successful. It appears to have worked.